Starting now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to one of our amazing session held by the GCY. Just for a moment. Is everyone with us? Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to one of our amazing capacity building session by CYMG Environmental Law Working Group. My name is Ola Alhajj, the MENA work focal point for Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform. Today we are going to get to know more about an astonishing event that started on the 22nd of March, 1989, and in which 116 states were represented. So, next slide, please. I'm going to be presenting with my partner, Shannon, and now we need to get to dive into our session. So, the Basel Convention, how it started and what's the history behind it. So what's about like having a story? The Basel Convention started on August 31 of 1986. The cargo ship Kiansi, registered in Liberia, was loaded with more than 14,000 tons of ash from waste incinerators in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The city had previously sent such waste to New Jersey, but the state refused to accept any more after the 1984. The latter intended to dump the ash in the Bahamas. However, the Bahamian government turned the ship away. Over the next 16 months, Kiansi searched all over the Atlantic for a place to dump its cargo. Dominican Republic, Honduras, Bahamas, and many countries. Its return to Philadelphia also failed. In January 1988, the crew finally dumped 4,000 tons of the waste near Genovers in Haiti, as what they told them as a fertilizer for the soil there. The Haitian Commerce Minister ordered the crew to reload the ash, but the ship slipped away. Over the years, various attempts to return the ash dumped in Haiti failed. So what in the remained until June 2002, when it was moved to mountain in the back origin in Pennsylvania, after a civil or government agency, including the Environmental Protection Agency, had found the consent to be classified as non-hazardous waste. The case contributed to the creation of Basel Convention about disposal of hazardous waste we know today. So, next slide, please. Okay, so the Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movement of hazardous waste and their disposal. What is it? Is a multilateral agreement negotiated under the United Nations Environmental Programme beginning in 1988. The negotiator of the convention wanted to promote environmentally sound management of exported and imported waste, especially in developing countries. It obliges its parties to ensure that such wastes are managed and disposed in an environmentally sound manner. The convention covers toxic, poisonous, explosive, and corrosive, flammable, ecotoxic, and infectious waste. Next slide, please. Its objective is to promote human health and the environment against the adverse effect of hazardous waste, and its aim and provisions. We're going to go one by one on this, but so as we told you that the Basel Convention is a convention that is concerned with hazardous waste. So the overreaching objective of the Basel Convention is to protect human health and the environmental against the adverse effect of hazardous waste. Its scope of application covers a wide range of waste defined as hazardous waste based on their origin. So its aim and provisions. The provisions of the convention center around the following principles: the reduction of hazardous waste generation and the promotion of environmentally sound management of hazardous waste whenever the place of disposal, the restriction of transboundary movement of hazardous waste except where it is perceived to be accordance with the principle of environmentally sound management, and a regulatory system applying to cases where transboundary movement are permissible, and addressing through a number of general provisions requiring state to observe the fundamental principle of environmentally sound management. Parties may, however, enter into bilateral or multilateral agreement on hazardous waste management with other parties or with non-parties, provided that such agreements are no less environmentally sound than the Basel Convention. In all cases where transboundary movement is not, in principle, prohibited, it may take place only if it is presented an environmentally sound solution. If the principle of environmentally sound management and non-discrimination are observed and if it is carried out in accordance with a convention regulatory system. So next slide, please. And the convention has its own strategic goals and objectives, and its indicators for measuring achievement and performance of the strategic framework. For goal 1, effective implementation of parties, including on transboundary movement of hazardous waste and other waste, the indicator here to measure the achievement of this goal is the number of agreed technical guidelines that assist parties in reaching a common understanding on definitions, interpretation, and terminologies covered by the Basel Convention. For goal 2, strengthening the environmentally sound management of hazardous waste and other waste, the indicator is a number of parties that have developed and implemented national strategies, plans, or programs for reducing the generation and hazard potential of hazardous and other waste. And there is like a full plan full of indicators, sub-goals, sub-indicators, and you can find it on the official site of the convention. And the same is for the goal number 3, promoting the implementation of environmentally sound management of hazardous and other waste as essential contribution to attempts of sustainable livelihood, the Millennium Development Goals, and the protection of human health and the environment. So the next slide, please. Actually, in this topic as well, we need to talk about the procedure forms of the heart of the Basel Convention, controlled system, and is based on the 4 key stages, which is notification. The country or the party that needs to export its waste need to notify the committee that we're going to talk about later, and as well to confirm and to notify the imported country. So the second stage is to consent and assurance of a movement document, and that needs to be clear between the both sides. And then happens the transboundary movement, and then the confirmation of disposal. The confirmation of disposal, that's the most important stage, which is the country that has imported and exported the waste needs to have facilities that dump the dispose of the waste properly. And there is a really amazing tool that the convention also have, is there is an implementation and compliance committee. The committee is a sub-solidarity body of the conference of the party of the Basel Convention that was established in 2002. And its objective is to assist the parties to comply with their obligations under the convention, and to facilitate and promote and monitor and aim to secure the implementation and the compliance with the obligation under the convention. So what the convention committee is trying to do is to improve the procedure of the convention. Okay, next slide, please. And here I'm going to pass the floor for my partner, Shannon. Shannon, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ola. I hope I'm audible and visible now. And thank you for that great background that Ola provided us into all of the technical intricacies of Basel. I think it's also important that we discuss a bit of Basel being the world's first attempt at, managing hazardous waste. And Ola, I'm perfectly fine with also sharing my screen, whatever's easiest for you. Let's get those slides back up if we can. Okay, maybe I'll go ahead and share my screen again. Sorry about that. So we can see what we're looking at here. Perfect. So, it's important to note, the Basel Convention in its original form, that was passed in 1989, was actually quite weak. It was a first baby step, so to speak, towards responding to the uncontrolled movement and disposal of toxic waste between countries. So the original convention itself didn't actually ban or restrict any movement or disposal of hazardous waste. It merely required prior informed consent between countries exporting and importing waste. So there was a huge push, in the early 90s, particularly for what's called the Basel Ban Amendment. And this prohibits OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries in the European Union, and then also Liechtenstein, which is a small country between Switzerland and Austria, prohibiting all of those countries from exporting hazardous waste to less developed countries. So this is the actual provision that gave Basel, as we know it today, its actual legal power itself to restrict the transboundary movements of hazardous waste, as was outlined in its aims and provisions, beyond just the communication and information sharing provisions between countries. So this is what sets Basel in its current form apart from, for example, the Rotterdam Convention, which we discussed in an environmental law session yesterday, which does not restrict movement of chemicals between countries. It only requires a notification procedure between exporting and importing countries for chemicals and trade. So it's important to highlight that the Basel ban came about because of the hard and long fought advocacy by countries in the Africa group and other developing countries. These are some of the most impacted regions in the world that are consistently champions of strengthened environmental policies and laws that benefit our shared world as a whole. So the Basel ban, despite being passed in 1995, as you see on your screen, unfortunately didn't actually enter into force until nearly 25 years later in 2019. So this is a very recent, operationalization of the Basel ban. And that's because it wasn't until 2019 that enough countries, there was a 3/4 or 75% requirement of countries that were parties to the original Basel Convention actually ratified the ban amendment. That didn't happen until 2019. And this was required for its quote unquote activation, so to speak. So now here in 2023, there are currently 103 parties to the ban amendment out of 190 parties to the convention. So a significant portion but still a ways to go. And just coming back to a slide that you might be familiar with if you were part of our Rotterdam session yesterday, I just wanted to put this up on the screen again to highlight and show that this is part of the reason why chemicals and waste laws and policies, like the Basel Convention, struggle to keep up with the ever-increasing production and disposal of new and greater volumes of chemicals. And you could see on your screen, a lot of this data comes from the Global Chemical Outlook, which is published by the UN Environment Program as well, providing trends and indicators for the world's production, use, transport, and disposal of chemicals. And you can see just what some of those figures look like, particularly the 350,000 chemicals estimated to be in circulation in the global market today. So policy and law, it can be, as we all know, a very slow-moving wheel when issues are not politically prioritized. And we've seen this in frustrating negotiations at the climate change COPs over and over again, at the Convention on Biological Diversity. But arguably, chemicals, waste, and pollution struggles with this the most, as it currently receives the least funding, the least media attention, and the least political priority of the three in our triple planetary crisis. So this is why it's on us as youth to raise the bar, and what we're doing to bring the youth voice to the chemicals processes at the UN in the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform of MGCY. And also, a reminder as well between Basel and then, the other two conventions that form BRS, the joint sister conventions, as they're now known. So the Basel Convention passed first and the Rotterdam Convention passed subsequently. Differences between the two, sometimes this is hard to distinguish with, as both of these conventions are very clearly focused on the transboundary movements of chemicals in some form. And that's the key point here. So Basel covers the movement of hazardous waste, so hazardous chemicals and waste between countries. It does not include non-waste materials, and it also doesn't include waste materials that are not considered hazardous, for example, glass, paper, etc., unless they themselves are contaminated with hazardous waste. And Rotterdam, exact opposite. Rotterdam does not cover waste, as in used materials being disposed of, since this is already the focus of the Basel Convention, but it rather fills some of the gap of non-waste chemicals. So it supports countries in making informed decisions about importing chemicals produced for trade, so non-waste chemicals. And as such, together, Basel, Rotterdam, as well as Stockholm, which was passed later, and I believe this is in an upcoming session on May 5th for the Environmental Law Working Group. They are all intended to work together jointly to help countries manage chemicals and waste from cradle to grave, so from their production to their use to their disposal. And this is why the conferences of the parties are held jointly in Geneva at the same time, and the 2023 BRS COPs are currently beginning this week, and we'll discuss those more shortly. So jumping into, again, the next kind of point on this slide, how has Basel been strengthened over time? This might be of interest to many of you, particularly if you're involved and follow what's going on with the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, INC, for the Plastics Treaty. So Basel now also has plastic waste amendments, passed in 2019. This is another critically important addition. And again, if you're following the Plastics Treaty process, you'll understand why. Our ability to manage and dispose of plastics is currently wildly out of control. And we're learning more and more each year through improved scientific and environmental sampling methods, just how far-reaching of an impact this has on the environment, on the food chain, and on human bodies. So beyond the long overdue process to develop the first ever treaty on plastics pollution, inclusion of plastic waste within the Basel Convention, again, quite a recent addition in 2019, is a huge step forward for several reasons. The first one is that we know that plastic waste most of the time equals hazardous chemical waste. And this is because of toxic chemical additives in plastics that give them their desirable properties in manufacturing, like flame retardants, PFAS forever chemicals that resist breakdown. It's an important legal recognition in Basel that plastic goes beyond just solid waste and is now defined as hazardous waste. And the second reason is that there has been and continues to be, this is a constant gap that needs to be filled and has been improving over time, but there's repeated patterns of loads of waste being labeled as recyclable or safe materials. You remember what Ola discussed, one case study of this, with that, the horrific history of ash being dumped in Haiti. There is this pattern throughout history and ongoing, of corporations and even countries at times trying to skirt around, regulatory and legal systems. Loads of waste material would be labeled as recyclable or safe, shipped out to developing countries often, and making it appear as if it's a win-win scenario, where country A has a place to send and manage its waste, and country B gets to stimulate its economy by boosting its recycling capability. But repeatedly, this recycling loophole was used to, again, sneak in hazardous waste and dump them in developing countries. So this is also currently the case for e-waste, countries shipping out old computers, for example, under the guise of quote unquote charity to be sent to schools, only for them to arrive in the ports, be distributed out and found to be completely useless. And now it's on the receiving country to have to process and dispose of this waste that's full of heavy metals, dioxin, and a suite of other hazardous compounds. And finally, just one more kind of key point for, the strengthening over time of the Basel Convention and why that was so critical, for its implementation as a law. So the Basel Convention now currently has a network of 14 regional centers that conduct training, promote transfer of technology, share best practices between countries and regions, provide technical assistance, and convey the regional priorities on the ground. At these big decision-making conferences like the COPs, and they also support countries within their regions in implementing the convention. So this is a very important, actionable, on the ground, implementing factor of the Basel Convention for those that are interested, particularly on the capacity building side, which we all know is critically important to the effectiveness of laws and policies. Otherwise, they're just words on a page. So moving ahead to the 2023 BRS COPs, just to go through this very quickly and give a very, expanded overview of what we're looking at in terms of what's happening right now with the Basel Convention. And when I say right now, I literally do mean right now, beginning this week. So upcoming negotiations, there's a updated, 10-year strategic framework for the Basel Convention. The previous strategic framework, decade strategic framework was between 2012 and 2021. So now parties are looking at, improving the effectiveness and implementation of the convention, update its strategic goals and objectives, the indicators for measuring progress. The strategic framework can sort of be looked at as a guiding star for implementation of the Basel Convention, updated over time based on, what the realities are, with our current technical capabilities, what we know about the movement of waste and how that has improved over time. So it's important that that gets kept up to date. There's also negotiations on technical guidelines for different waste categories. So plastic waste, as we mentioned before, now that we have implemented the plastic waste amendments, it's going to be important to outline what that looks like in terms of, actionable items and defining how we address plastic waste under the Basel Convention. Also looking at persistent organic pollutants, which is a major point for the Stockholm Convention. You'll learn more about that if you tune in on May 5th, along with battery waste, and another big point, e-waste as well, which very much is the next step in terms of what needs to be strengthened, regulated and controlled when we talk about transboundary movement of waste. It's not currently adequately included within the Basel Convention. So there's a big push by a significant number of member states to not only come up with technical guidelines for e-waste, but potentially including a e-waste amendment, for example, just like was implemented with plastics. And then there's several text amendments as well, kind of more focused on very specific portions of the convention itself. So there is a proposal put forth by the Russian Federation. This has to do with the prior informed consent procedure that was outlined by Ola earlier. It proposes adding a 30-day deadline for importing countries to respond to the notification by the generating or exporting countries that are looking to ship out hazardous waste materials to that country. And then there's also a European Union proposal to amend several annexes to the Basel Convention. These are intended to provide further legal clarity on some specific categories of disposal operations. There's two, so recovery versus non-recovery. How do we better define those to further, clarify the convention, and also, lean into circular economy movements? So recovery, just to give a very basic overview, just so we know what we're talking about on this slide. Recovery would be things like reuse and recycling of waste towards a beneficial purpose. So taking substances that are used or are considered waste and putting them back into the wider economy, putting them back into use. So this speaks to those circular economy approaches. Non-recovery is largely what we think of when we think of disposal. So this is, not putting waste materials back to any beneficial use. It's disposing of them in a landfill or an impoundment, releasing them into water bodies or the atmosphere, for example. And this is a good time, now that we're talking about the COPs, to also just bring us back to, again, the importance of youth engagement in Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm, so BRS together, along with all of the chemicals conventions. And as I mentioned before, chemicals and waste has struggled over time to garner the kind of attention that climate change and biodiversity loss have gotten. And that's not to say that they, are at the level of political priority that they should be either. But in terms of the triple planetary crisis, where all of these different issues feed into each other, chemicals and waste certainly has largely been left behind. So this is where we as youth come in. So there's two key reasons I kind of outline here, just boiling it down to the very basics. When someone asks you, why should youth get involved in the Basel Convention or chemicals and waste in general? The first one is that youth are one of the most vulnerable, if not the most vulnerable population group to chemicals and waste mismanagement. And some of the reasons, for this vulnerability, well, one, for example, countries in the global south that, are known to shoulder the brunt of hazards from global chemical production and pollution also tend to have a larger proportion of youth in their population. In the context of waste management, it's common, for the labor of children and young people, for example, in the highly hazardous informal e-waste processing settings, to be used because children have smaller hands, able to dismantle tiny, intricate parts of equipment, and they're more often employed at much cheaper rates than adults. And then, the second kind of point here too is that it's important to remember that young people and children are not just smaller versions of adults. We have different developing body systems that experience often more severe impacts to hazardous exposures than fully developed adult bodies. We drink more water and breathe more air proportional to body weights, and as such, take in more toxins proportional to body weights. But we're also just now beginning to understand the full range of damage that can be caused to developing bodies and organ systems. For example, we know well and understand largely the neurological effects caused by early childhood lead exposure, for example. These have been well studied. But looking across different age groups or age disaggregated data when it comes to most other chemicals is not currently happening. So this is going to be a huge area, for science and policy together to progress in, what those differences in exposure and effects between different population groups, regions, socioeconomic circumstances, et cetera, look like. And then the second reason, kind of moving beyond the vulnerability discussion for a bit, is that, at the same time, children and youth are not just this group, this helpless group that is served by environmental policies and negotiations, but leave it up to others to negotiate. Rather, youth are change makers in their own right. They bring a lot of creativity, and we know this well from even the group that's on this call, spending their morning, afternoon, or evening learning about the Basel Convention, but bring a lot of creativity and new ideas to the table in terms of how to improve environmental laws like Basel. So it's important that Basel is responsive to the needs and priorities of children and youth. And kind of bringing us to our final slide here, and then I'd love to open it up to any questions that anyone might have. Just wanted to mention that, the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform, which is the chemicals, waste, pollution focused and mandated constituency of MGCY, following processes from BRS to SciChem, Strategic Approach to National Chemicals Management, to Minamata, to lending a voice to the INC process as well. We are mobilizing youth engagements in BRS, including having members on the ground over the next 2 weeks at the 2023 BRS COPs. So I just wanted to extend an open invitation to anyone that's interested, in Basel or in its sister conventions, that wants to engage in the ongoing COPs or process in the future. We have a youth assembly prep meeting for the BRS COPs planned tomorrow, the 2nd of May at 8:30 a.m. Eastern time, which is 12:30 UTC. This will be an opportunity to provide online participation, for the COPs, and, have an open door to contribute your input to the process, even if you're not able to attend in person, because unfortunately, this is a meeting that's not being held in hybrid capacity. So we're doing everything we can as the youth to expand opportunities for participation as much as we can, and gather youth input. So all are welcome to attend. And you're also, welcome to join the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform's BRS discussion group on WhatsApp, which is linked on the slide, and we'll also copy that to the chat for you, where we will be sharing consistent updates on BRS there. So I want to just finally extend a huge thank you, to Santhia and the Environmental Law Working Group as a whole for preparing and convening this series of environmental law sessions to share information about the key environmental conventions across our youth constituencies. And if Basel interested you, then I hope you'll also consider tuning in for the Stockholm Convention presentation on the 5th of May, which I believe is at 1400 or 1420 UTC.